We started this week with 173 teams from around the world, and we have debated our way down to our final 2 teams. Proposing the motion is Team West Los Angeles Violet, and standing on the other side, the opposition is Western Ohio Blue, and today they will be debating the following. This House believes that housing is a guaranteed right. Let me state that again. This House believes that housing is a guaranteed right. And to propose the motion, I invite the first proposition speaker from West Los Angeles Violet.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are beyond excited to debate this round, but before we begin, we admittedly have a lot of thank yous. The thing is, we are here as the product of so much support from the amazing people in our lives, so we think they should get to share this moment with us. First, thank you to our teammates, Katie and Bodhi, who, while they're not on the stage right now, have had the impromptu energy for us in every round, have sung Coldplay by Paradise every single round, and these past few days have made this the best experience for us. Thank you, Bodhi, for winning the coin flip 6 rounds in a row. We don't know how you did that. Thank you, Katie, for always making us laugh with your incredible team TikTok ideas. On behalf of our whole team, we also want to thank the NSDA, TAB, and all of the judges for hosting this tournament. This has been a wonderful experience for us, and it's genuinely been a dream come true to get to this point. This educational activity has made all of our lives so much better. And our sincerest gratitude to our coach, Brandon Babb, for dealing with our shenanigans 24/7, but also helping us maximize our potential across the board. We'd also like to thank Bobby Labita and the West LA District for believing in us from the very start and supporting us every single step of the way. We are so excited that we get to be a part of this team. Now, for our teammates that aren't on the stage right now, Bodhi would like to thank his coach, Jack Meany, and his parents who have allowed him to prosper and grow in such a meaningful activity. Katie would like to thank her parents for their constant support and for driving her an hour every single day to debate practice for years. We know, that's insane. Katie would also like to extend an immense gratitude to her Nova 42 debate family, but specifically Mike Kyle, Michael Murray, and Ted Kim. She would not be the person or debater that she is now without them, so thank you for everything. And on a personal note, I'd like to thank my family. Mom, you taught me to always have integrity and kindness in my ambitions. Dad, you taught me not to doubt myself, even when I did it frequently, and you taught me to have grit. I'd always also like to thank my coaches, Tia Basilio, Ronit Lieberman, and a mentor and teacher of mine, Susan Moore. Tia, thank you for telling the young freshman who didn't know anything of me that a topic you don't know yet isn't a topic you shouldn't learn. I'm incredibly grateful for the curiosity you fostered in me. Now, last but not least, thank you to all of our opponents in rounds past and now. There was no one else we'd rather end our debate careers with, and all of that being said, I'm very honored to now start off this round as the proposition's first speaker. Okay, is everybody ready? Awesome. When Americans think of January 6th, they think of the insurrection at our nation's capital. But for millions of individuals in Los Angeles, that date has an entirely different meaning. On January 6th of this year, our home of Los Angeles implemented an anti-camping ordinance that prevents the unhoused from sleeping, camping, and functionally existing in public spaces. It is because we on Team West Los Angeles Violet have firsthand seen the devastating impacts of not having housing as a guaranteed right that we are so proud to stand on the proposition of this motion. This House believes that housing is a guaranteed right. Just 2 things in this speech. First, some framing observations to contextualize this debate for you, and then second, introducing our first 2 substantive arguments. My partner Sungjoo will introduce the third. But before that, a couple of key clarifications on framing just down the bench here. Firstly, we would define this House as a moral society. Second, given this is a beliefs motion, this isn't a debate on the specific policy action. It's a debate on whether or not we believe taking policy action broadly in the first place is a good belief. Third, if we're talking about guaranteeing housing, we're talking about guaranteeing adequate housing. Obviously, if the motion were this House believes that food is a guaranteed right, we would be defending guaranteeing adequate food and not just leftovers out of a trash bin. Fourth, beliefs have consequences. We're willing to concede that this House, as a broader society, holding the belief that housing is a guaranteed right, isn't going to automatically solve the global housing crisis, but what we do think stems from this societal belief is twofold. First, there's a galvanization of increased capital, resources, and support for the organizations doing the on-the-ground work to solve the housing crisis in the status quo when society adopts this belief. But second, policymakers are realist in nature, that is to say, they are responsible and responsive to what society believes. Thus, in the long term, the dispersion of the belief that in broader society, we are able to think of these people as humans spurs political, economic, ideological, and even practical change. Substantive one, then, is the principle of human dignity. The thesis of this argument is that housing is fundamentally a human right, and we therefore believe that it is a guaranteed one. Why is that necessarily true? Firstly, we think that basic necessities are key tenets of well-being and life and are definitively also human rights. It's the same reason why things like food, water, basic autonomy, and free thought, and so on and so forth, are principally core standards that constitute human life as opposed to inanimate or wildlife. Secondly, the social definition of human has always concerned communal relationships. That is to say, in order to have safety and dignity, one must not be ostracized and coercively isolated by the rest of society. It's morally repugnant and inhumane to banish certain people as outcasts simply because they don't live in a decent manner enough as society would like them to. Thirdly, housing is instrumental to human self-dignity and self-concept. Our homes are primary aspects of our identity, and they serve as a materialization of our place in society. At that point, we predicate much of our perceptive value on them. Fourthly, though, the material disparities between unhoused people and the rest of society. Housing is central and foundational to the things that we have, like education, healthcare, food, water, and sanitation, so on and so forth. That is to say, the sheer level of injustice and discrimination that unequal access to housing upholds is a form of structural violence against human beings. Why then does something being a human right necessarily mean that we think it should be a guaranteed one? We think this is fairly straightforward. Firstly, given we have just recognized housing as a human right, that means this House believes that every human should pragmatically have access to a home. There's no other way to facilitate that than by guaranteeing it. Secondly, we would say on a basic definitional level, a human right is largely synonymous with a guaranteed one at the point at which they each describe a set of standards and protections applicable to all humans simply because of their existence as humans. What are the impacts here? The principal mechanization operates on a higher plane a priori to the practical. That is to say, it doesn't matter what you end up believing about the pragmatic feasibility of this motion, the declaration of housing as a guaranteed right is principally good in and of itself, and at the point at which housing propagates inhumane structural disparities and deprives many of self-concept and worth, we are very proud of that, but you seem to disagree.
Oh, okay. Is there a difference between acknowledging a right and guaranteeing a right?
Okay, here's what we're going to tell you. We're going to tell you that, first of all, when society writ large acknowledges a right, that makes it easier practically to guarantee that right, because society influences policymakers. That leads to a whole slew of practical impacts. But that being said, let's go ahead and talk about those impacts. Substantive 2 is benefits to the unhoused. The thesis of this argument is simple but incredibly important. Lacking shelter threatens the immediate safety, but also the long-term livelihood of all of those who are unhoused. 4 key layers of analysis under this argument. The first layer here is safety and health. We would characterize that on a very intuitive level, not having the protection of 4 walls around you makes you physically vulnerable to compromised health and bodily safety due to things like harsh weather conditions. We think that looks like an increased risk of dehydration due to excessive heat, of hypothermia due to paralyzing cold, and severe illness due to a lack of sanitary protection. We'd ask you to imagine Chicago, the coldest winter ever, without a home to seek warmth in. The second layer here is about abusive households. In a domestically violent relationship, the abuser isolates their victims from their support network, their family, their friends, and essentially anyone who can give them the resources to escape. Insofar as the abuser typically has complete financial control of their victims and requires those finances, victims of domestic violence who leave the abusive relationship often end up unhoused. However, the status of how we treat the unhoused in the status quo is so unlivable that we see individuals being deterred from escaping those situations and being forced to stay in those abusive relationships. We fundamentally believe that in cases like these, accessibility to housing is a necessary mechanism for escaping abusive households. Our side of the house would guarantee these survivors a form of safe escape. But before I move on to our third layer here, I'll go ahead and take a point.
If all these issues exist in the status quo, how can we say that housing is right now a guaranteed right?
Okay, we think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the motion. We're going to get into this later. I think Sungjoo's actually frontlining those responses. But the key issue here is this motion is not whether or not housing is guaranteed in the status quo. Obviously, we're not arguing that as a truism, given that it isn't guaranteed in the status quo. What we're arguing is if we believe it would be a good thing for it to be guaranteed. That's really what this round is about. That's going to be key as we go down the bench. Third layer of a substantive here is the unhoused to jail pipeline. Firstly, unhoused people are disproportionately antagonized as a result of governments criminalizing actions that are necessary for unhoused individuals to survive day-to-day life. That looks like city ordinances against loitering if someone sleeps in a park or trespassing. That looks like law enforcement over policing the unhoused. That looks like 25% of the unhoused being subject to this state-sanctioned violence. Secondly, this also implicates socioeconomic mobility at the point at which jail time is the most automatic turnoff for employers when hiring. The fourth and final layer here concerns socioeconomic mobility. A lack of housing often makes it impossible for the unhoused people to forge their own lives, and they permanently become entrenched in socioeconomic immobility. Why is that necessarily true? Firstly, note that the massively widespread social stigma against unhoused people means that society runs rampant with negative perceptions, commonly including things like uncleanliness, inhumanity, laziness, and many horrendous biases. That's why roughly half of Americans attribute homelessness to people who have a lack of will, or why there have been nearly 2,000 violent attacks against them by people who are housed in the past 2 decades. But even if not everyone shares those beliefs to such extremes, these implicit biases largely blanket society and fester between the cracks of the foundation. What exactly is our comparative then? On our side of the house, we broadly get society to declare housing as a guaranteed right. Now, ultimately, panel, all of West Los Angeles Violet would love to live in opposition's perfect world, where we fly back to LA and suddenly have no issues with the housing crisis. But because we don't ameliorate themselves without the type of societal paradigm shifts that our side of the house fosters, we are so incredibly proud to propose.
The chair thanks the proposition for their perspective on this issue and now invites the first opposition speaker to present their viewpoint.
Good afternoon. Before we begin, Western Ohio would also like to thank a few people before we get into the round. So on behalf of Western Ohio, we would like to thank the NSDA, Director J. Scott One, and Simpson College for their continued support of World Schools Debate. We would like to thank the Kentucky District and the entire city of Louisville for making it possible to be able to stand here today rather than on a computer screen. Ohio Debate, thank you for making every weekend our own mini-nationals with exemplary and challenging competition. Thank you to our World Schools coach, Mr. Bill Prater, who has worked tirelessly within our district and state to not only provide the competition that we crave, but also prepare us for this tournament. Most of us have had the pleasure of having him as a coach of multiple years, and lessons we have learned will stay with us far beyond that time. The competitors from Whitmer High School would like to thank their coaches, Marie Wetzel and Bill Prater, for dealing with endless hours of pacing around, discussing arguments, providing blunt but necessary constructive criticism that got us here today, and teaching us the value of this activity that has quite literally become our lives. We would also like to thank assistant coach Evan Kelly for his extemp and impromptu coaching that has helped us build our background knowledge and speaking skills. The competitors from Mason High School would like to thank their coach, Kunal Ponkshe, for first stepping in as a parent volunteer, but becoming a beacon of support and love for our team. More than a coach, she became a mother figure for all of us, pushing us to become better versions of ourselves each and every single day. Mason would also like to thank our debate coach, Vinamra Agrawal, for his constant dedication to our debate program. He's been instrumental in getting us this far, and we couldn't imagine debating without him. He's put up with a lot of our whining, but always stuck with us, and we hope to make him proud today. We would also like to thank our parents for the members on our team, Eric and Stephanie Frank, William and Lisa Declerq, Sunena and Ajay Pongshe, Ravi and Krishna Meruga, and Shiva Vangala and Indira Katipoli, as well as friends and family that have supported our passion for speech and debate, despite the confusion on their face when we mention a power clap, breaking into the trips, or our obsession with G2 pilot pens. Finally, we would like to end with a message to all past, present, and future competitors to remember the power they hold when they utilize their voice, whether it be within your team, your school, or your community. The power your voice holds to spearhead change is immense and boundless. Be the change you wish to see in the world by utilizing your voice for good. Ready? All right. Now, for my judges are ready, I will begin with the first opposition speech. Maria de Pena grew up on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, working from the young age of 8 years old to relocate from a filthy, crime-ridden neighborhood to a quieter, smaller community closer to the countryside. But this lovable community, Villa Autodromo, quickly became the victim of the 2016 Olympic Games held in Rio, bulldozing this neighborhood for the sake of building pools, parking lots, and parks, displacing 700 families and leaving them no choice but to relocate upon their own merit. Because we believe that the world that should be isn't the world that is, we are so proud to oppose this motion. This House believes that housing is a guaranteed right. As an observation for this round, this motion does not read, "This House believes that housing ought to be a guaranteed right." It says that this House believes that housing is a guaranteed right now. Thus, it becomes the counterburden of our opponents to prove how housing is guaranteed in today's world on a pragmatic level. Remember, there is a difference between the natural right doctrine of an ought right and the pragmatic level positivism of an is right consideration. Thus, do not allow our opponents to uphold a side of the House that does not fall within the scope of today's motion. During the speech, I'll be doing a couple things. First, I'll go over some framing for the round before looking at side propositions versus substantive arguments. Finally, I'll present side oppositions versus substantive arguments, while my partner Bhuvan will present our third. So first, let's go into the framing for the round. What our opponents tell you is that we must look at this round as if we were acting as a moral society, and at the end of the day, if everyone has housing, that's a good thing. But the thing is, we do not disagree with this. We see that housing has benefits, and we agree with most of their arguments. However, the issue is that we can't argue that because of this, because it doesn't exist in the status quo today. The motion reads, "This House believes that housing is a guaranteed right." Acting as a moral society and saying that it ought to be a guaranteed right is different from the scope of the motion and what we're debating today. If we were to say, "This House believes that the sky is blue," we're not saying that a moral society believes that the sky ought to be blue, but we're arguing that right now, in the status quo, what we're seeing is that the sky is blue. And what we're seeing right now in the status quo is that the guaranteed housing is not a guaranteed right for all people. But now, let's go on to their first substantive argument, which is the principle of human dignity. Once again, what they tell you is that these guaranteed rights have key benefits to humans, especially in their dignity. Again, we have to look at the distinction between the words ought and is. If this motion read that this House believes that housing ought to be a guaranteed right, then everything they say holds true. However, the motion does not say that. It says that it is a guaranteed right, which we are seeing is not the case, as I'll get into my first substantive arguments. But then, going on to their second substantive arguments about the benefit of providing humans this dignity with housing, everything they state is purely in the principle and not the practical sense. What we're seeing is that right now, housing is not guaranteed in the status quo. We're seeing the endemic effects of this. We agree that housing is good for people, but when it's not guaranteed, and it's not guaranteed right now in the status quo, as we see on the opponent's side, we're proving that this is not the case. Just because we have a moral society doesn't prove that this is going to happen. Even if we believe that housing is good, we have to make sure that housing will be guaranteed for everyone, even in our opponent's world. But now I'll go into our first two substantive arguments. Our first substantive argument, a home in your head but no actual bed, concerns access to housing. Home is where you hang your hat is the age-old narrative, yet there are so many people around the world who have no place to hang their hat. Currently, there are 26.6 million people worldwide without a place to call home, despite the, quote, guarantee of the nations whose responsibility it is to provide for these citizens. Simply put, nations implement policies for mitigating homelessness without truly upholding the right to housing. Look to Scotland, who recognizes the guaranteed right of housing, yet their only initiative is to pay up to 125,000 euros in relief funds compared to the 236,000 euros it costs to rent the average single one-room apartment. Because this mechanism has not succeeded in its ability to reform or craft benefits for these individuals, one cannot argue that housing is guaranteed in Scotland. Simply assuming that our opponent's world of principle recognition makes any source of progress disregards the implementation of this motion. In observing United States trends, the assumption that housing is guaranteed is undermined by the separation between the minimal government programs and the private housing market. Currently, only 37 affordable and available homes exist for every 100 extremely low-income renter households in 2019. Thus, even if the United States sought to pay for the rents of homes for all of these citizens, there would not be enough housing in order to ensure this right. especially because of housing scarcities in the market to ensure the most amount of profits and economic growth in the private sector. For our opponents to assume that housing is guaranteed when there are fundamental issues that prevent any of these impacts from being reached is idealistic and not any way pragmatic. I will now take your point if it still stands.
So side opposition tells you that it's not a good thing that places like Scotland are creating progress. Don't let the ideal of perfection be the barrier to legitimate progress.
We have to look at what this motion is asking us to analyze, and that is in this world, in the status quo right now, is housing a guaranteed right? And that is just one example of why it is not today. But now, I'll move into our second substantive argument, a home today, but homeless tomorrow, which concerns holding claims to housing. An underlying assumption of guaranteeing housing is that those who are fortunate enough to have a place to call home are able to keep it. Eviction, eminent domain, war. Even governments who say they guarantee housing often fall prey to these circumstances or use them to their advantage in order to deprive people of the housing that they occupy. Within the year of 2021, 84 million people were removed from their home countries around the world, whether they be internally displaced citizens, refugees, or asylum seekers. When we observe the trends of the wretched sea, we know as the housing markets, the infamous landlords often show no mercy to those who fail to pay up. If we look at the Kaldari group, 33% of their population was forcibly evicted due to the 1956 Soviet decree prohibiting vagrancy. They were evicted out of Roma and forced to stand by and watch the demolition of their homes, all while their right to guaranteed housing was forgotten in a dark corner of the bedroom. Even then, the more concerning issue with this principle is the actions of the government to further violate the supposed guarantee of these rights. Take, for example, eminent domain. The process of governments removing citizens from their homes for a greater purpose, where those removed are not compensated pragmatically more often than not. In light of the 2008 Olympic Games, 1.5 million residents are forced away from their homes as Beijing renovated to host these games. This trend is not unique to China. In fact, Al Jazeera 2021 explains that some 720,000 people were displaced in Seoul, South Korea ahead of the 1988 Games, and in Atlanta, Georgia, where several public housing projects were demolished before the hosting of the 1996 Olympic Games. In the past 50 years, more than 2 million people have lost their homes due to gentrification and remodeling of cities for sports' largest mega event. I'll take your point.
Side opposition tells you that refugees and victims of gentrification don't have homes. Side opposition, we'd like to ask you, what is the principal justification for some to have homes but do not guarantee it to others?
That's not the issue of this debate. We agreed that these refugees and the people displaced by gentrification ought to have homes. But that's not what the motion is asking us, whether they ought to have housing, but whether they do have housing, whether housing is guaranteed for them, which right now it is not, and that's the issue. The series of unfortunate events does not end here. In fact, refugee crises perpetrated around the world reveal these sad truths that countries do not value the presence of all lives. If we look at the situation in Ukraine, a total of 7.2 million people were forced to leave their homes as the country was ravaged by the presence of war. The nations of Somalia, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and South Sudan carry upwards of 68% of the world's refugees, yet they continuously fight over who ought to take in these refugees. This power struggle leaves the people without homes, and our opponents are advocating for a side of the House that continues to remain complacent with the sad reality of the world. Housing may be fundamentally important, but it is not guaranteed. If a person who currently has housing today cannot be guaranteed that they will have it within the next year, how can governments possibly house those who haven't even achieved that first step? Therefore, we are so proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you for your opposition perspective on this motion. We now call the second proposition speaker to continue this from their side.
Cool. Everybody ready? Panel, opposition tells you about a world wherein this debate could be won by their side citing the truism of 26.6 million people being unhoused and thus housing isn't guaranteed, they win. But because this abusive view of this critical discourse is a cop-out to the real conversations we needed to have today regarding this motion, in that vein, so proud to propose. What should you expect in this speech? First, on some key framing clashes that this debate can't function without. Second, refuting the material that opposition just gave us in their last speech. And third, rebuilding our own material and introducing our third substantive argument. But before that, a couple of critical notes on framing. First and foremost, what is the difference between guaranteeing and acknowledging a right? We would tell you that the difference is because acknowledgement is a prerequisite to action. Both of them are very minimal at core. In the long run, the difference is very small. But you can't guarantee a right without acknowledging it, and you shouldn't acknowledge a right without guaranteeing it. Second thing we want to note on framing is that this motion isn't one on truth testing. They're running from the spirit of this debate and the heart of the motion. Obviously, as a truism, a housing crisis does exist. But for Opt to say we need to provide that that truism isn't true is confusing at best and abusive at worst. We would tell you this is an absolute tight case. But third, even if you don't buy that their interpretation is abusive, remember that Proposition Bench gets to define this House as a moral society. They agree. At that point, our burden is merely to prove the truth of the statement that a moral society should do this kind of action. We tell you we believe in that fundamental principle. But we can make this really easy for you. If this House is a moral society, Proposition merely has to prove the statement a moral society believes that housing is a guaranteed right. That's the way you should be looking at the motion. But fourth, at that point, the derived comparative is, does a moral society believe states ought to guarantee housing? That's the only way that we can actually have functional discourse without proving a tight case on our side of the House, insofar as that they're running truisms and telling us we have to disprove them. We think that's the true spirit of the motion. At that point, let's move into refuting their own arguments. The first argument they ended up giving you was on the access of housing, and they tell you, hey, there are 26.6 million unhoused people in the world, so clearly housing isn't guaranteed in the status quo. Firstly, as we already told you, this debate doesn't functionally revolve around a truism. This debate revolves around whether or not it is a good thing for a moral society to believe in that states ought to guarantee housing, given that they are the only actor that can do so. We tell you that's where the debate and the heart of the debate this ended up lying. But secondly, our side of the House told you from first that the acknowledgement that something is a right by a moral society is the only way to galvanize, one, local resources to ensure that kind of thing ends up existing, but second, in the long run, guarantee that policymakers have a realist perception of the world and form their policies importantly after that. We think their side of the House, in copying out of that discourse, is going to deprive those same people of the true justice that they end up deserving. Before I move on, I'll take your point if there still is one.
How do we determine what a moral society looks like without any semblance of how the real world functions?
We told you that a moral society believes in certain things, and that's where the debate needs to occur, but we can't have that discourse because you guys just said, oh, here's a truism, and thus at that point, we're going to lose this debate. We're telling you that a moral society cares about people, cares about human dignity. We mechanize why exactly this is true, and their side of the House doesn't engage with any of that material except saying, hey, homelessness is going to exist in the status quo, thus clearly it's not a guaranteed right. After we gave you 8 minutes of material as to why that wasn't true, and then we told you that this House, as a moral society, believes that housing needs to be guaranteed. But at that point, the second argument they ended up giving you was, hey, you have a home today, you're going to have homelessness tomorrow. Again, this suffers from the same truism that they end up telling you about, because again, at any point, if there is a cyclical housing market, that means the implication here is that you have a home today, homelessness tomorrow means homelessness will always exist. So clearly, guaranteed housing doesn't exist in the status quo. We would tell you on our side of the House, again, this suffers from the same truism trap that they end up telling you. You have to prove why the obligation isn't on states. You can't just say X problem exists, we all agree, thus you lose the debate. There would never have been any functional discourse. I'll take your point before I move on.
Just because a society is moral, does that mean that we will pragmatically guarantee housing for everyone?
Again, we told you that we're not going to take any policy action on our side of the House because this is a believes motion. But we told you that if moral societies have this vision and have the belief that this is true fundamentally, then all realist perceptions of policymaking from that point on means that we're going to get those types of guarantees. The principle drives the practical in this instance. But rebuilding our own arguments, the first argument we ended up giving you was on the principle of dignity. And we gave you 4 clean mechanizations into this. Firstly, we told you that if something is a key tenet of life, it is a human right. Secondly, to preserve human dignity, we ought not to ostracize or coercively isolate people. Thirdly, housing helps sustain one's self-concept. But fourthly, housing is central to material equality. The only lip service we hear from their side of the house on this is, oh, we agree, but that's not what the motion says. So again, it all comes down to their interpretation of the motion being fundamentally skewed and in trying to make proposition prove that a truism isn't true. Obviously, that's not what the heart of this debate was about. But we would also tell you that the important thing to note here is a moral society's belief in states' obligations to do such actions only comes from the point at which you side with our side of the house, because if something isn't true in the status quo, we need to ensure that at that point, we believe that moral society, these types of values need to exist. Only our side of the house acknowledges that fundamentally. Second argument we ended up giving you, though, was on the benefits to the unhoused. And we gave you 4 clean mechanizations into this. Firstly, we told you about physical safety and health. Secondly, we told you we're providing an escape for victims of domestic abuse. Thirdly, we told you about how there's an unhoused to jail pipeline because government bodies have currently and historically been ostracizing those who need the help the most. But fourthly, we told you that socioeconomic mobility through destigmatizing people and providing them better resources to get jobs only exists at the point at which moral society believes in this type of guarantee. Then the only lip service again they give you is, oh, we're going to cross-apply this grand notion that we have a truism on our side of the house and thus your side of the house is never going to win this debate. But the problem with that argument and the problem with their side of the house functionally at that point is they disregard the true discourse that needed to revolve around safety and health. They needed to address the arguments on how we provide an escape. They don't ever deal with the problems of the unhoused to jail pipeline, and they don't ever deal with the socioeconomic mobility problems in the status quo, the deficit we have of that, purely because they never deal with the actual crux of this debate. That's the central problem and strategic flaw that they ended up making. That being said, let's move into our third substantive argument on the international refugee crisis. The thesis of this argument is that we sit at the qualms of international refugee crises today. From the crisis in every Ukraine, to the migrant camps at the footsteps of non-entree regimes everywhere, even to the regional human geography shifts across the borders of the continent of Africa, we see millions of internally and externally displaced people with no place to go. Just 2 ideas underneath this argument. 1, the declaration of something as a right compels more popular support. There is a greater propensity to protect that in international countries at the point at which policymakers have their mindsets altered in terms of their legislative perspectives. But we think that declaring housing as a right compels people to view it as such in all future considerations and external contexts, and at that point, change becomes galvanized. 2, what does this ameliorate? We think that large paradigm shifts of resources only occur at the point which society believes something is important. Look to the abolishment of slavery, the protection of gay marriage, the institution of women's rights, and so on. Prior to society adopting the morally unconditional belief that those ought to be guaranteed, there was no codified incentive to view those issues as important. But once enough of society believes that, that dispersively changes. That's why we're telling you, as a moral society, you ought to believe that. The impact here is simple. The proclamation of housing as a human right leads to better policymaking by applying the newfound declaration internationally and across issues. We think that's really important. But at the end of the day, remember, from the streets of Los Angeles to the cities of Brazil, all the way down to the core of humanity, it takes a shift in your beliefs to solve this crisis. Thank you so much.
The chair thanks the proposition for their continued perspective, but I am also quite certain the opposition has not had their last say on this topic. I invite the second opposition speaker.
All right, is everyone ready? You guys good? All right, then we'll start the time now. Jocelyn Figueroa lived in Washington Heights, New York, when gentrification in her neighborhood led to small businesses being pushed out and corporations such as Taco Bell and Marshall's moving in. The result of this? Well, besides the digestive issues from Taco Bell, soaring rent prices, leading to her landlord, with no remorse towards the situation, told her, you know, I could rent that apartment for a lot more than what I'm getting for you right now. Unfortunately, Figueroa ended up homeless and was not given an alternative solution by her landlord, by her community, or by her government. Because we believe that stories like these expose the hollow nature of a guarantee to housing in the real world, we are so proud to oppose this motion. In this speech, you can expect a couple of key things. First, I'll be defending the opposition's substantive arguments before reviewing the propositions and presenting our third, final, substantive argument. With this in mind, let's look to the opposition. First of all, look at our burden, which is really, really important, that there isn't much interaction with. The idea that they have to show it in the status quo, not some moral absolute called a moral society. They have to answer a very key question. How do we determine what this moral society looks like? All they say is that a certain individual would know what is moral, and therefore the entire society knows what's moral. But without any grounding or semblance from the real world, we never know what it means to be moral in the first place. Here's why that's crucial for your ballot. That means that we have to ground their conception of a moral society from at least some idea of the real world. That's going to be really important when you look to the pragmatic actions that we discuss in our case. With this in mind, let's go to our first argument about the access to housing. What they talk about is that it's not a truism because you're always going to have certain guarantees in this moral society, which is our exact point. Look at the example of Scotland that we give you, that even when they had the supposed guarantee right to housing, in practicality, they weren't giving them enough money for the individual to actually be able to afford a proper house. No thank you. Here's why that's really important. You can take them at their highest ground, by their entire conception of this resolution and motion, and still comfortably vote opposition. Because what we prove to you is not that it's not only the idea that housing is not a guaranteed right now, but that when it is a guaranteed right, even if you buy that voting proposition does create a guaranteed right in this moral society, that it's still problematic because of loopholes in the system and the legislation not being as effective as they sell it to be. That's where the main clash of this debate comes, and it's something that they fail to respond to on a fundamental level. But then we'll go to our second argument on holding onto houses. All they say is that, again, is a truism, but our argument is grounded, again, in the real world. That's the main split of this debate, that they're giving you a complete nebulous ideal without any semblance from the real world. No thank you. But what we are telling you is how a moral society would function in an exact sense when you look to opposition or look to proposition. What's incredibly important are all the examples that we give you. Remember the example of eminent domain, of the Soviet decree, of the Beijing Olympic Village, all of which they never touch on by making this blanket statement that we're only looking to a truism. But what we're telling you is that even if a guarantee is made, even if people believe that in this moral society and that legislation happens as a result of it, from this progress, these issues still exist, but it doesn't just exist, it gets worse. Here's why. We become complacent. It's the idea that we think we've solved the issue. We think we've made a problem, but in reality, we're not solving any of the issues that exist in the status quo. That's the exact problem with proposition. What they're telling us is that, well, we'll throw a blanket over it and acknowledge the fact that we've solved the issue because we've made this guarantee. But we're recognizing the underpains of our system today, that when we have a certain policy, we're not solving the issue, especially when we look to the real world. I'll take your point.
It is a truism that gentrification and homelessness exists. Do you think a fair burden or any productive discourse exists when you force proposition to disprove a truism in a debate?
Look, I've made this very clear from the beginning of this speech. We are not saying that a truism is what you guys have to defend. We are just saying that you have to look at the real world from some semblance. It doesn't make sense for you to say that one absolute moral nebulous is how we should look at this debate when you've given us no semblance on how we actually achieve that. We are looking to the real world. You guys are looking to hot air. With that in mind, let's go to side proposition. There's a couple key things that need to be addressed. We agree with their ideal that acknowledge it and guaranteeing go hand in hand. But what's really important is, again, the real world. That when we have guarantees, we don't get the benefits that we seek to achieve. Remember that side opposition is looking at the actual acknowledgement that there are problems in our system of guaranteeing it. Side proposition is looking to a moral world that makes their life easier by saying that one guarantee solves all of our issues. If there's any truism in this debate, it comes from side proposition. But with that in mind, again, they talk about a moral society, but put them at their highest ground by everything that they believe, and you'd still vote very simply in opposition because we're looking to what happens when you actually guarantee something like housing. They're looking to the assumption that that would actually work. Let's go over to their first argument about dignity. Now, they make a pretty big deal about the interpretation, but let's look at what they themselves say in the first proposition, that when we have a moral society that's pushing towards the guarantee, and we create this guarantee by acknowledging it, that leads to more influence on policymakers and more policies, which is, again, our problem exactly. That is those policies that lead to the issues and the issues that we see in the status quo, like Los Angeles, like the Soviet decree, like gentrification. But then in their second argument on benefits, the same thing exists. They tried to say that we're disregarding the true discourse of this debate, make a very principled argument to make opposition seem like the bad guy, when in reality, we're the ones fighting for change. We're the ones acknowledging the fact that there are problems in society where proposition wants to say that one guarantee solves all issues, when in reality, the guaranteeing is what makes us complacent to those issues. But finally, let's go to their third argument on the international refugee crisis, which is going to be incredibly important. But before we respond to that, I'll take your point.
How do policy guarantees that we prove we mechanize on our side of the house not provide policy actions in the long run?
Right, that's exactly what we're saying. That in a pure moral nebulous that you guys advertise to us, sure, you'd get those benefits. But what we prove is that when countries and international law pass legislation, there's always loopholes that are taken advantage of, and people are not actually going to follow this law, which is something that we discuss further in our third argument. But now that we've addressed that, let's go to their third argument on the international refugee crisis very quickly. It's our thesis as the opposition that this guarantee doesn't actually work in a pragmatic sense, and we'll get to that right now on our third substantive argument. No housing for those without a home, a false guarantee for a refugee. What happens to those who fall outside any country's jurisdiction? Professor James C. Hathaway of the University of Michigan outlines this issue by explaining that as refugees travel from one country to another, countries face the dilemma of harboring a refugee that doesn't fall under the authority due to the inefficiencies of laws and governments. Specifically, international and domestic laws both denote that so long as a refugee migrant is not within an egregiously small radius of a country's chosen location, that the said refugee is not under the country's authority. Because of this, while refugees struggle to enter a country and fall under the gaze of any legislation, countries get to toss around responsibility concerning a refugee's livelihood. Consider Mehran Karimi Nasseri, an Iranian man and student at the University of Bradford, where he protested against his home government of Iran. Attempting to return, he was expelled for his actions overseas. While traveling to seek asylum, he lost his refugee papers and ended up stuck in a terminal for 18 years. The United Nations problematically quantifies that out of the 84 million refugees in 2021, 27.1 million of them potentially face these same lives of Nasseris because of these empty guarantees in legislation. We would never call a broken promise a guarantee. We would never call the right to housing a guarantee, especially when those who come to countries seeking asylum are denied that housing. Because the supposed guarantee, even in a nebulous moral society, ultimately ignores those who desperately need housing the most. We couldn't be prouder to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments on this topic. We would like to continue with the proposition, speaker number 3.
Side opposition has made one singular argument in over 16 minutes worth of substantive speeches. And it essentially boils down to, hey, read the motion. And you know, they're right. The motion does say housing is a guaranteed right. Oh wait, no, sorry. It says this house believes housing is a guaranteed right. Because the fact of the matter is, if the motion was just some kind of fact, for side opposition to come up here and laundry list a bunch of examples that, yes, are objectively true about the world and that we have no ground to be opposing, then there isn't debate whatsoever. Because we believe in the fundamental principle of world schools debate, I am so proud to continue proposing the motion. A couple of key things here. Firstly, we're going to analyze some points on framing before moving on to the 3 key clash questions that are going to implicate and close the sale of this house of your ballot for proposition. With that being said, the point on framing. Note that truth testing, or actually analyzing the truth or falsity of a statement, isn't what world schools motions are in the first place. They give you a couple of arguments here. The first one they say is we need to look to the status quo. And in the status quo, these things just don't exist. Firstly, we would note to you that proposition inherently in any form of debate is proposing some kind of change from the status quo. It's inherent in the term itself. But second argument they give you is that look at this motion that would be this house believes the sky is blue, for example. Exactly. That argument is inherently true. That statement is inherently true, and there's no debate that can happen given the sky is always going to be blue. That's the exact kind of statement that they're trying to oppose this ground on. But third key argument they give you here is that the bottom line is that essentially all they need to prove is a bunch of these examples, a bunch of case studies about how refugees are being removed from their homes and therefore housing doesn't exist in the first place. But firstly, we again would tell you that this is impossible to win for us given that we don't have ground on our side. But secondly, on the bottom line, we tell you this is completely crossing the House by trying to absorb 8 minutes of Nadia's proposition material because they know how right we are. With that being said, though, let's move on to the 3 key clash questions that are going to implicate your ballot. First key clash question, why is proposition's worldview in general more fit for the round, and how can we better engage them on their highest ground of the motion the first time that's going to happen? Let's talk about this. Firstly, note that they're running from the heart of the motion, as Sungjoo already tells you. But secondly, you've heard the arguments. Even if you don't buy any of that, and you're willing to go for their model of the ballot, we're going to be the first to engage it head on. A couple of arguments here. Firstly, we would note to you that guaranteed rights don't exist in a utopian vacuum. Right? It's completely unfair for them to burden us to prove that in every single instance, every single person in the world, they have guaranteed housing that lasts for an infinitely long amount of time. We would tell you that if they want to look to the real world, if they want to look to the status quo, then they need to burden us with something much more realistic in the first place. Secondly, though, we would tell you that you should look to our positive feedback loop argument that Nadia and Sungjoo tells you. If something would be beneficial or principally good if this House were to believe it's true, then you have an obligation to believe it as this House. This is a debate about whether it's good to believe in this motion or not. That's why it starts with this House beliefs in the first place. Second key argument they give you here is exactly the pragmatic benefits that are going to make sense. The second key clash question then is why is proposition the only side with actual pragmatic benefits? They give you a couple of arguments here. The first one comes out in the op2. They tell you, oh, legislation is going to be ineffective because there are general loopholes in the system. A couple of summative responses here. Firstly, we would tell you that we don't actually support any legislation specifically. That's what we've told you down the bench. They can't actually just come up here and say that nebulous legislation, examples that we haven't supported from the real world, haven't worked in the first place. Second key response here, though, is that this completely misses the boat of our solvency mechanization. We told you from the one that the way proposition is solving for this world is by essence controlling the mindset that people have, the perspective that people have of unhoused populations. That is to say, their principal perspectives dictate and control policymaking in the future. So at the point at which we are declaring, proclaiming as a House, as a moral society, that housing is a guaranteed right, that's the same point at which future policymaking gets influenced under those same conditions, and that's the point at which that context is applied to external issues. I'll take the point, though.
I'd like to make it very clear that in your first proposition and your first substantive argument, you say that even in a moral society, believing in something leads to policy being made and policymakers being influenced. How can you say now in your third speech that you're not influencing and supporting any legislation being made?
We literally just said we are influencing policymakers to make policy. The argument was that we are changing their mindsets. We're not going to force them to make some kind of policy. We're not passing policy ourselves. We're saying we are positively changing the way they view the world from their realist perspective so that they make the kind of policies that would be good because they're starting off with the scope of viewing unhoused populations as somebody who is actually deserving of a right to housing. That's the point at which we're going to propose. Second and only argument they give you here is that, oh, the guarantee is made, even if it's made, the issues get worse because we get complacent. So let me get this argument straight. They want to oppose good change, objectively good change, that might give people sustainable housing because we might think we solved the problem. Okay, apply this argument everywhere else. Let's not make any climate change reform because, oh, we might get too complacent in it. Let's not do anything good for the world. Let's not do anything good for refugees. Let's not make any domestic reform because we might get too complacent. This link is not specified at all to our argumentation. And at the point at which we are providing you actual analysis as to why this is specifically good for this motion, that's the point at which their generic complacency argument is simply not going to work in the first place. Then opposition comes up here and tells you that they want to fight for change, that they're the actual side that's changing in this motion. In fact, I would say that the only complacent side in this debate is the side that lists a ton of example-level harms, claims they can solve them, and in the end does absolutely nothing in this round because that's the essence of what opposition bench has given you. Let's examine their third new substantive here. Let's examine their third new substantive here of how refugees are struggling to enter. This is going to clash well with our third new substantive. Let's see who's going to generally solve it best. The first thing they tell you is that, oh, countries can just toss around responsibility generally. I got deja vu here because the Global Compact on Refugees of UNHCR is generally going to solve for that. I'm sure you guys know the linkage material. But the second thing I would tell you more seriously is essentially that the empty guarantees in legislature that they talk about are completely solved at the point at which our legislation isn't actually specifically mechanized. We tell you that the kind of legislation that countries end up passing at the point at which they view unhoused populations, i.e. refugees, as people who are deserving of a home, who are deserving of rescue, who are deserving of foster, that's the point at which these countries are going to better be able to take in those situations and better be able to combat those conditions. That comparative flows proposition entirely. Because in the status quo, countries obviously don't want to take in these refugees. But the reason we tell you that is true is because policymakers, state officials, and world leaders are viewing those people from a different perspective, from a principally harmful perspective that we think we fix on our side of the house, at the point at which we tell society that these people do deserve rights, unhoused populations do deserve housing. So proud to propose.
As we head towards the end of this debate, the chair invites the third opposition speaker.
The Chicago Housing Authority claimed to undertake the largest housing rehabilitation project in the history of the United States in the year of 2000, guaranteeing housing for those who were displaced during initial renovations. But fast forward 20 years, and 30,000 individuals remain on the waiting list to receive housing from the CHA. And yet, land that was once public housing complexes are now leased to the Chicago Fire, Chicago's major soccer league affiliated club. Land that was once developed and promised to the poorest of the poor that have bare necessities has now disappeared, leaving thousands of people stranded. Because we believe that the world that should is not the world that is, we are so proud to oppose this motion. During this speech, I'll be asking 3 key questions to really get to the crux of what this debate is really about. So let's move into that first question. What demonstrates a guarantee within a round? Remember, our opponents are approaching this motion in a way that is not how the motion is actually worded. A duck walks up to a lemonade stand and he says to the man running the stand, "Hey, got any grapes?" The man says, "I only have lemonade." Our opponents are trying to draw grapes out of this motion when it is actually about lemonade. We are not talking about whether or not there ought to be housing is a guarantee. We are debating whether or not it is a guarantee on a policy level and on a level of how it is pragmatically implemented into the status quo. Do not let them allow this debate to change that way. Simply because I write on my flow that our team is going to be the champions in this debate does not mean that we are actually going to be the champions in this debate. It comes down to actually going and looking at how this debate has actually occurred, that we actually make a decision and actually see how this has materialized. But then, our opponents try to claim that our view is abusive. But remember when we tell you that just because we can believe that something ought to be moral, that does not mean that the motion also says that we have to believe that it is actually guaranteed. We see that you can believe that roller coasters are dangerous, or you can say that roller coasters are dangerous. There are 2 different areas within this analysis. Because of this, our opponents are simply misinterpreting the motion itself. What we see is that this House believes that housing needs to be reformed because these leaders are simply engaging in complacent overviews that do not change or acknowledge the issues that both sides in this debate propose are actual issues. When we look at South Africa, where sure, in the beginning of their constitution, they state that housing is a guaranteed right, but then Article 26 backtracks and says that, we actually have the rights to address this in ways that are specific to certain circumstances, whether or not it's actually guaranteed. Sure, they agree that it ought to be guaranteed, but that doesn't mean that it is. Because of this, our opponents cannot access their impacts because of the fact that they're not arguing the motion at hand. But even if you take them on their highest ground, we're going to address this in the second key question. What is the difference between acknowledging something and actually guaranteeing it? Throughout the world, many moral societies exist, and they acknowledge that housing ought to be guaranteed. But despite that, despite the policies, we still see these disparities. But I'll take your point.
Opposition talks a lot about how they want to change the complacent nature of world leaders. Exactly what kind of change takes place on your side of the house?
Right. This is what we're actually going to be describing to you throughout the rest of this question. You guys propose a declaration of a guarantee. First of all, that does not ensure that the guarantee already exists, of which our opponents must defend in this motion. But secondly, we have to recognize that through the examples that side opposition gives you in this round, the actual examples of where declarations of guarantees have existed, they have not changed the fact that there are still people who do not have homes. Simply declaring that it ought to be guaranteed does not guarantee that housing. Our opponents say we must look at progress. And on our side of the house, we tell you that progress comes from first acknowledging the issues with the complacent side of the house that says that it is guaranteed when the reality is that it is not. No thank you. But then, we can even further this, but you must recognize that there is an issue with the current status quo of countries declaring guarantees before you can actually create change. You must go to the doctor before you can actually be treated for a disease. You must recognize that you are sick before you actually go to the doctor. But then, this acknowledgement that our opponent says leads to a guarantee. But remember what we tell you, a guarantee does not lead to solutions. And that is what this debate must be recognizing on the basis of the opposition's thesis. But let's move into the final question for this round. Before I ask this question, I will take a point.
We would point you to ineffective governments exist and are symmetric on both sides of the house. Why then aren't guarantees a reason to vote proposition in countries with effective governments?
Yeah, what we're telling you is that because of the fact that these guarantees that are declared have not actually created the changes that you seek to uphold, your declaration of guarantees, or quote unquote saying that the guarantee is there, has not materialized in creating these benefits. You give us no examples of where this has been successful, where we give you several throughout 3 substantive arguments where it has failed. But let's ask this third question. What does guaranteed housing actually look like? Well, this would be looking at protection of housing rights without the corruption of their side of the house. Policies that continue to remain complacent. Just because something is good does not mean that influencing that policy will not create the changes that they try to argue for. What we're saying is our opponents give us no platform for the House to make this change because they contradict themselves constantly. In one speech, they tell you that they do not have to defend policy action because this is a moral debate. But then in their third speech, they come up here and tell you that policy changes are essential to making the change that they seek to uphold these moral standards. The recognition we tell you is that simply declaring this guarantee does not change the fact that there are 26.6 million refugees who do not have homes. It does not change the fact that 50 million people have been displaced because of the Olympic Games. This recognition has not changed the actual reality of housing as a guarantee. Our opponents talk about changing a mindset, but remember, how has this actually happened? When they bring up the GCR, remember, this document itself has failed in saving the refugees because there's no accountability. And that is our proposition, that we tell you that there is no accountability for this quote-unquote guarantee, and thus there is no change. Instead of our opponents, we have to look at this pragmatic guarantee versus the principal ideas of what the world should look like. Because let's go back to the motion. This House believes that housing is a guaranteed right. The reality of the matter is that it is not, because right now it is a statement that is treated as a broken promise. Our opponents are simply seeking to perpetuate this broken promise where we seek to gain the trust and gain the truth of this statement. For these reasons, we are so proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
As both sides of this debate have thoroughly and extensively explored the motion, we would now like to invite the opposition reply speaker to conclude their side's perspective.
Right. Is everyone ready? You guys good? Okay. Then we'll start the time now. This debate has unfortunately been really, really messy. If I'm being completely honest, we started with this debate being about a truism and ended with it being about a moral society that we have no idea of what it looks like. So let's delve into that idea first and foremost. As the opposition, our burden was very clear from the beginning of this round, that we are not saying that they have to defend a truism, rather that their conception of a moral society has to very simply be rooted in the real world. I asked this question in my last speech, and they failed to answer it. How do we know what a moral society looks like? What their nebulous conception of a perfect world looks like without any conception of or semblance from the real world? That's the main split of this debate. That my opponents from the beginning of this round have told you that in a perfect world, we would pass a perfect policy where we have perfectly good individuals getting perfectly good homes. But all we are telling you is to recognize the underpinnings of a country, the way that it looks at its policies, the way that it thinks it's going to make something versus how it actually does, and that's why we're not looking to my opponents in this round. What they try to tell you in the last speech is that they're looking to objectively good change, that we are positively changing the way that a country would think about homeless individuals, and that's how they would make the guarantee. But the main issue that we give you here is that that same situation has played out in all the examples that we list you from the real world. Remember Scotland, who gave the guarantee of housing to all individuals. They probably thought at that point that they were the moral society, that they were the perfect country, making the perfect policy for the perfect houses for the perfect people. But what we saw in reality is that the holes in the legislation made that impossible. They didn't give them enough money to buy any adequate housing, and in reality became complacent, still thinking that they were a perfect society while they were only making imperfect policies. When you look to what the proposition tells you in their next speech, the fact that they're going to create more change, more policy, that the opposition does nothing while the proposition is gold and creates the best society possible, recognize that it's all hot air. They've given you a lot of reason to prefer a perfect world when they're not looking one. They're not creating a perfect world because that's not the sort of ideal that you get when you look to proposition. At the end of the day, when you step back and you're looking at the absolute mess of a flow that you probably have because of how terrible this round has been in terms of clarity, ask yourself one question. If I was believing in something, would I believe it in a fantasia, in a world that I've never even known about, in a world that I don't even know has a specific idea, or would I believe it in the real world? That's our exact issue. That when you believe something, when you look at the logic that they give you, at how belief pushes for a public policy, that not only contradicts what they tell you about how they're not defending a policy as a proposition, but also tells you that when that policy is passed, it's not perfect. It has holes in it, holes that are exploited from the get-go that lead to certain individuals not getting the benefit that they want. My opponents are not looking to a perfect world, they're looking to false hope. If you were someone that didn't have a home in Scotland, and now you heard ideas of a perfect policy because you were in a moral society that was making that sort of ideal, making that guarantee to you, but you suddenly don't get it, how would you feel? Probably disappointed, and that's how we feel based on how this debate has gone. In the next speech, proposition is going to get up here and give you a perfect world again. Time and time again, they've told you that there's objectively good change, that they're the ones creating it, but they're the ones that are making us complacent. They're running down the same path that every single example that we've given you concerning eminent domain, Scotland, the Al Jazeera, and the Beijing Olympic Village have had in the past. That they think they're making a good policy when in reality, they can't make positive change, but they're going to throw a blanket over it because now they've made a guarantee. But the place where you look to us on your ballot is about refugees. Remember what Olivia tells you, that the GCR, their only defense against this argument, has failed, and it proves our point entirely. The fact that there's no accountability, despite there being legislation, is the exact problem with creating these guarantees. That it might seem like a policy that solves the issue, but it's only one that makes it worse. Because we're looking to the real world and how a policy would affect us as individuals, not a moral society that's never existed before. We are so proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
The chair thanks Team Opposition for their insight on this topic and invites the reply speaker for the proposing side for their concluding remarks and to wrap up this debate.
Panel, if today's motion was this House believes that jobs are a guaranteed right, it would not be enough to just say that employment exists and that means that side opposition would just win this debate. Key issue here, we lack the mechanization on their side of the House as to why something like a federal jobs guarantee would be harmful. The same thing exists in today's debate. We don't get any engagement on the actual clash of today's debate because all they've been doing is arguing a truism. For that reason, very proud to oppose. Okay, what can you expect from the speech? Right off the top, a couple clarifications to iron out persisting disagreements. Next, an analysis of the substantive level of today's debate. Before finally, a comparative evaluation of the overarch to bring this debate home. First off, let's start off on a characterization of the mishandling of the motion on opposition's end and why that's going to necessarily implicate your ballot prop. First up, we hear opposition's first speaker come up here and tell you that they win this debate if they prove that there are unhoused people in the status quo because that's all a truism is. Okay, very interesting then, because their second speaker comes up here mere minutes later and tells you that they aren't debating a truism. What they want you to tell them is how you're going to create a realistic world. Big issue here is the case tension. Why? Which one is it, Op? At the point that we are 4 speeches into this debate, closing out the entire round, we tell you it is far too late to still be arguing over what's going to happen on your side of the House. That lack of clarity is going to be particularly condemning. Next. Sungjoo and Alex tell you down the bench why this illustration is quite problematic and why the lack of clarity is going to be condemning. I want to talk about what that particular implication is. Let's talk about why that's going to seal your ballot proposition. Firstly, side opposition continues evading meaningful discourse. That is to say, clash does not exist when the debate is being held on different grounds. Remember, our grounds are the fact that we want to actually debate the spirit of the motion. We don't think a truism does that. No, that's still what they're defending on their side of the House. Second, we think it's pretty problematic that opposition asks you to not house the unhoused on the idea that they don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but they don't want to create complacency. Okay, side opposition, here's the issue. At the point that you create no solvency, you're living in the status quo. What does that mean? That means that opposition characterizes to you a world where refugees aren't housed, a world where we have eminent domain. They tell you about all of these problems. We completely agree. All of those problems exist. Here's the key issue. Opposition does nothing about that. Side proposition is the only side of the House that aims to create any change whatsoever. All right. Next, what we want to tell you is that opposition's best stance then is telling you to vote off of a world where the very gentrification, the things like not accommodating refugees is going to happen, but then do absolutely nothing about that. Note that that means the strongest offense that this panel can give side opposition is going to be the very status quo that both sides of this House agree is incredibly flawed. That means that our first path to the ballot here is going to be on the societal paradigm shift on our side of the House. 3 implications. First, our side of the House accepting that moral societies want to galvanize change. Second, that tells policymakers to galvanize policy change. That creates practical impacts on our side of the House, like ensuring that people can actually have houses. But then third, that we get that good policy in the long term. Note that that's not complacency, that's change. We think OP fundamentally mishandles that issue. We think that's what led to policy changes like in Austria, Portugal, Singapore, etc. Note that best case scenario, their best mechanization or their best example here is Scotland. That's a 2040 plan. What does that mean? They don't know what's actually going to happen in the end. What we're telling you is going to happen in the end is fundamental policy change. Second path to the ballot here, potentially even more important, is the principle that gets absolutely no engagement. Why does that matter? We tell you from the top, this principle is going to seal your ballot because it operates on a higher ground. That is to say, if you believe things like human dignity are important, you are absolutely and definitely voting side proposition. That is to say, if you think communal relationships are important to us as humans, if you think that isolation and ostracization are a bad thing, you are voting op in every single instance. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry.